Not just a channel, a journey through your roots. Subscribe to keep going. 37%. In some valleys, 70%. That's the share of men across parts of Croatia, Bosnia, and Serbia who carry the same single paternal genetic marker. A lineage geneticists label I2a Dinaric, or IPH908. Families in these regions have passed down a specific claim for generations. This marker proves an unbroken line stretching back to the Illyrians, ancient tribes who supposedly held these mountains since before Rome existed. It's a point of pride, stitched into folklore, nationalist textbooks, even tourist plaques in some towns. Population geneticists who've actually dated the expansion of this lineage found something that doesn't fit that story at all. The genetic signal doesn't stretch back into deep prehistory. It explodes, suddenly, sharply, in a window roughly 1,700 to 1,900 years wide. That places its origin squarely inside the Roman to early medieval period, not the Iron Age, not the Bronze Age, not anywhere near since the Illyrians. And that timing lands suspiciously close to one of the most argued over, most politically flammable migrations in European history. A migration that more than a few Balkan nationalist narratives have spent decades trying to minimize, reframe, or erase outright. Here's the structural problem, and it isn't a matter of opinion. An identity built on the phrase unbroken ancient bloodline cannot coexist, unmodified, with a genetic signature that reads sudden population event. One of those two things has to give. So if the male lineage now dominating the Balkans didn't explode into existence until 13 or 14 centuries after Christ, whose Balkans were these before that? And what happened to them? The story most people already accept, the one in the textbooks and the family lore alike, goes like this. The Balkans were the ancient homeland of Illyrian, Thracian, and Dacian tribes, peoples whose presence is traced back into the Iron Age and further still. Rome came, and Rome stayed. Provinces like Illyricum, Dalmatia, Moesia, and Pannonia spent centuries under imperial administration, absorbing Latin law, Latin military structure, Latin speech, until the provincial population by late antiquity was heavily Romanized, Illyrian in blood, Roman in habit. Then, starting in the 6th and 7th centuries CE, came the chapter every regional history course covers: Slavic-speaking groups moving south across the Danube, settling in among the existing Romanized Illyrian populace and, over generations, linguistically absorbing them. Historians have a tidy word for what supposedly happened next: ethnogenesis, not replacement, blending. Newcomers and residents folding into a single new South Slavic identity, each contributing something, neither one vanishing. To give that story scale, researchers point to deep time evidence. A landmark 2018 Nature study led by Ian Mathieson, working with the Reich Lab at Harvard Medical School, sequenced 225 ancient genomes recovered from southeastern Europe, spanning roughly 12,000 to 500 BCE. That research documented Anatolian farming populations mixing with the indigenous hunter-gatherers of the Iron Gates region of the Danube, a genetic blending event that happened thousands of years before any Slav ever crossed the river. It's held up as proof that this land has always been a place where peoples merge rather than erase one another. Layer it out and it reads like a smooth staircase. Hunter-gatherers, then farmers, then Bronze Age steppe migrants, then Illyrian and Thracian tribes, then Roman provincials, then a Slavic linguistic shift on top. One continuous lineage, gaining new influences at each step but never actually broken. It's a comfortable story. It's the story people want to be true. It only works, though, if the Y chromosome data, the strict, unbroken record passed from father to son, the genetic equivalent of a surname that never changes, behaves the way a smooth continuum should behave, and it doesn't. Here is where it gets complicated. If Slavic migration really had been just an addition, new arrivals settling among a large, already established Illyrian and Roman provincial male population, then those older paternal lineages should still be visible today as the dominant genetic signal, sitting comfortably at the top. Still there, they largely aren't. A detailed 2005 Y chromosome survey by Marjanovic and colleagues, published in the Annals of Human Genetics and conducted through the University of Sarajevo, looked closely at Bosnia-Herzegovina's three main ethnic populations: Bosniaks, Croats, and Serbs. It found the I2a lineage sitting at the top as the standout majority marker in all three groups. Not one group's marker, not a minority signature, a majority signal that cuts straight across modern ethnic and religious lines that people treat as ancient and fixed. That same year, a separate high-resolution phylogenetic study by Pericic and colleagues, published in Molecular Biology and Evolution, was built specifically to trace what the researchers called major episodes of paternal gene flow among Slavic populations. Their conclusion pointed the same direction. This I2a expansion carries the signature of a relatively recent demographic upheaval, not ancient continuity, something closer to a founder effect, a small starting group whose lineage rapidly outcompeted, numerically, whatever paternal lines came before it. Clean, expected, or so the folklore assumed. Instead, the lineage long treated by regional folklore as the ancient Illyrian survival marker, the genetic proof that these families never left, never mixed, never broke, is, according to these same studies, most consistent with a founder effect tracing back to the Slavic migration period itself. The marker people point to as evidence of the natives may be evidence of the newcomers. A signal this dominant, spread this evenly across Croat, Bosniak, and Serb populations alike, cannot be explained by a small elite of migrants quietly blending into a much larger existing population. The math of male lineages doesn't support gentle absorption. Researchers are careful to frame this as probability, not certainty. Ancient DNA modeling deals in likelihoods, not verdicts. But the pattern keeps pointing the same way. To be clear, this doesn't mean Illyrian ancestry disappeared. Autosomal DNA, the whole genome mix inherited from both parents, not just the father-to-son line, still shows continuity with older Balkan populations in the region today. The deeper ancestral mix didn't vanish. But the male line did something else, something the unbroken bloodline narrative was never built to explain. Something happened to the fathers of the pre-Slavic Balkans that didn't happen to the mothers. And that single asymmetry reopens the entire question of what arrival actually meant. 13 centuries ago, in these mountains. The first theory says there's nothing sinister here at all. That this is simply what large-scale, non-violent absorption looks like when you zoom in far enough on the numbers. In this model, Slavic-speaking groups arrived in numbers substantial enough to gradually dominate the existing gene pool, not through conquest, but through generations of intermarriage and cultural pull. There's supporting evidence for it. Autosomal ancestry modeling on modern Balkan Slavic-speaking populations has estimated somewhere in the range of 50 to 70% Eastern European-associated ancestry, with the remainder tied to older Mediterranean and Balkan substrate populations, though that specific percentage varies noticeably by study and by region, and should be treated as an approximate, contested figure rather than one settled number. Still, taken broadly, it's consistent with a population that experienced substantial, but incomplete, replacement over time. The mechanism historians point to is slow and structural, not violent. Centuries of sustained Slavic-speaking settlement, followed by the rise of medieval statelets and church administration, Orthodox in some regions, Catholic in others, that rewarded assimilation into whichever linguistic and cultural group held local power. Intermarry, convert, adapt, and your descendants belong to the dominant group within a few generations. It's a reasonable model. It explains the language shift well. Almost too well. Where it runs into trouble is the Y chromosome itself, that strict paternal-only line, showing a turnover this sharp, this near total, rather than the slow, blended, gradual pattern you'd expect from an intermarriage-driven demographic shift. Intermarriage explains why the language changed. It doesn't easily explain why so few of the old fathers' lineages survived the transition at all. There's a second explanation for that gap, and it's far less comfortable than peaceful blending. The second theory doesn't ask why men blended in. It asks why so many of them simply weren't there to blend in the first place. Call it the male-biased demographic disruption model. It starts from a harder premise than intermarriage, that in the centuries surrounding the collapse of Roman provincial administration in the Balkans, the pre-Slavic male population wasn't gently outnumbered. It was thinned. Plague, warfare, repeated raiding along a frontier that Roman garrisons could no longer hold. Political collapse that left local communities exposed for generations, not years. This isn't a fringe idea borrowed from nowhere. Elsewhere in Europe, population geneticists have documented this exact pattern during other major migration events, periods where adult men bore the brunt of conflict, forced displacement, and differential mortality, while women, children, and maternal lineages carried on with far more continuity. Mitochondrial DNA, the genetic line passed only from mother to child, a kind of maternal thread that never touches the father's side, often tells a much steadier story than the Y chromosome does, in exactly these kinds of upheavals. And the scale involved isn't small. In some regions of Europe where researchers have studied major historical population turnovers, Y chromosome replacement has been documented approaching 90% or higher. even in cases where whole genome, autosomal ancestry shows only a partial shift underneath. In other words, a population can look mostly continuous in its overall genetic makeup, while its paternal lines are almost entirely erased and replaced. That's not an exotic outcome, it's a documented one. If that's what happened here, it changes what Theory 1 actually means. A peaceful blending story only works cleanly if there was a large, stable, existing male population for the newcomers to marry into. But if male bias disruption is the real driver, then the reason Slavic paternal lineages came to dominate so completely wasn't that they simply outnumbered the locals through generations of intermarriage. It's that the local male population may have already been unusually depleted before that process even got underway. Blending didn't do this by itself. Something thinned the field first. To be direct about the limits here, no single named study has yet quantified pre-Slavic male mortality in the Balkans specifically. This is an inference drawn from comparative population genetics elsewhere in Europe, not a settled regional finding. And researchers who work on this are careful to frame it exactly that way, as a plausible mechanism, not a proven one. But even this explanation quietly assumes something the record doesn't actually hand you for free, that there was a clear, singular, original Balkan male population to begin with, sitting there before the disruption, waiting to be thinned. And that assumption is where the story gets even less comfortable. The third possibility, the one most researchers are hesitant to say out loud in plain terms, isn't about disruption at all. It's about the question underneath it. Here's the problem. Go back far enough, using the same ancient DNA record that gave us the Roman and Iron Age layers, and the idea of a single original Balkan population simply stops holding up. Matheson's genomic survey of the region shows that the Balkans were already a layered mixing zone thousands of years before a single Slavic speaker ever crossed the Danube. There was no clean starting point to disrupt. There never was one. The clearest evidence sits at the Iron Gates, the narrow Danube gorge separating modern Romania and Serbia. Individuals excavated from the same sites, buried in the same era, sometimes meters apart, carry entirely different ancestry profiles. Some are fully local hunter-gatherer in origin. Some are fully descended from Anatolian farming populations that migrated in from the southeast. Some are a mix of both, different origins, same ground, same time. That tells you something uncomfortable. This pattern of absorption, replacement, and mixture isn't a Roman-era story, or even an Iron Age one. It's older than agriculture in the region. It's older than any named ethnic group anyone alive today claims descent from. Here is where the story stops being about the Balkans specifically at all. If Balkan identity was already a genetic patchwork by 6000 BCE, then every chapter that came after, Illyrian, Roman, Slavic, isn't a disruption of some original population. It's simply one more layer painted over a surface that was never blank, never singular to begin with. To be clear, this doesn't mean identity itself is meaningless, or that culture and belonging don't matter. It means the search for one clean founding bloodline may be asking a question the genetic record was never built to answer. Picture the Iron Gates gorge itself, roughly 8,000 years ago, long before any of the later chapters existed. Not open farmland, river cliffs, fast water, fish-rich rapids cutting through limestone. This is the world of Lipensky Vir, a riverside settlement where archaeologists uncovered distinctive trapezoidal dwellings and the burials beneath and around them. Genomic sampling from those burials shows something remarkable sitting in plain sight. Some individuals buried there carry entirely local hunter-gatherer ancestry, families who'd fished these waters for generations. Others, buried only meters away, carry entirely Anatolian farmer ancestry, descended from people whose ancestors had never seen this river before. Two populations who, at some point, shared no common tools, no common foods, no common language, no common gods. The smell of river fish being smoked and dried over open fires, the sound of a language with no surviving trace, spoken by people none of us can name, and somewhere in that world, according to isotope evidence drawn from their bones, at least two of the individuals buried at Lipensky Vir weren't born locally at all. They were migrants, people who had walked or traveled from elsewhere entirely, and who were folded into this community so completely that they were laid to rest inside its most sacred rite, alongside people whose families had lived on this river for generations. A stranger's bones, resting inside a community's most sacred ground. That is the oldest known version of exactly the same story this entire episode has been circling. Thousands of years before Rome, thousands of years before any Slav crossed the Danube, thousands of years before anyone thought to draw a line between us and them in blood. So here is the reframe, and it changes what everything before this moment actually means. The Balkan bloodline was never a bloodline at all. It's a palimpsest, a surface written on, scraped down, and written on again, at least 4 separate times, on the same stretch of geography. Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, Anatolian farmers, Bronze Age populations arriving from the steppe, and, finally, the medieval Slavic paternal line event this episode opened on. That number from the very beginning. The 1,700 to 1,900-year-old explosion of the I2a lineage was never really a story about the Balkans in some singular sense. It's simply the most recent of several near-total paternal line turnovers this region has lived through. The one closest to living memory, the one closest to modern identity politics. Not the deepest layer, not the truest one, just the freshest coat of paint. And here's the detail that cuts hardest against the nationalist version of this story. Croat, Bosniak, and Serb communities, groups that have spent generations, in some cases fought wars, over claims to separate ancient bloodlines, carry the same dominant Y chromosome lineage from the same medieval event. Not 3 ancient bloodlines, one shared paternal history sitting underneath 3 modern identities that insist otherwise. Layer this land at the paternal line level, and it's been demographically overwritten roughly once every few thousand years for at least 12,000 years running. Every generation that lived through each of those overwrites almost certainly believed their version was the ancient one, the original one, the one that had always been there, not by years, by centuries, and then again, and then again. None of this settles which mechanism did the heavier lifting: peaceful blending, male-biased demographic disruption, or the deeper truth that there was never a clean original population to disrupt. The current evidence holds pieces of all 3, without fully resolving the mechanism. Researchers studying this are careful to say so themselves. Widen the lens past the Balkans entirely, and the pattern doesn't get more comfortable. It gets more universal. Everywhere population geneticists have looked closely enough, Britain, Anatolia, the Iberian Peninsula, and here, the same structure shows up. Not a single continuous thread running back to one founding people. A stack. Replacement over mixture, over replacement, over mixture again. Identity, nationalism, inherited pride. So much of it rests on a quiet, unexamined claim. We were always here. The DNA record, again and again, almost never fully backs that claim up, anywhere it's been tested closely. Bloodline turns out to be less a biological fact than a cultural invention laid on top of a far messier reality. One that refuses to map cleanly onto any modern ethnic or national line, no matter how firmly people believe it does. The Balkans were never who we thought they were. And maybe, when the DNA finally speaks clearly enough, no bloodline anywhere ever is.